What if the life you lived was only half of the story, and the other half was hidden from you on the very day you were born? I am 76 years old, and I am telling this now because time has finally cornered me. For decades, I believed my childhood confusion was normal, that the quiet tension in my house was just how families were back then. I was born in 1947, just after the war, in a small hospital where questions were not encouraged and silence was considered respect. My parents never spoke much about that day, and I never pushed. Back then, children did not interrogate their parents, especially not about birth records, missing photographs, or why my mother avoided certain dates on the calendar every year. Still, there was always a feeling I could never explain, a strange sense of absence, like something had been taken from my life before I had the words to miss it. Growing up, I noticed small inconsistencies, documents that did not align, a birth certificate that looked altered, relatives who went quiet when I asked about family history. At night, I sometimes dreamed of conversations I had never lived, of a voice that sounded like mine but answered differently. I dismissed it as imagination, because the truth was far more unsettling than fantasy. As the years passed, guilt replaced curiosity. My parents aged, and I convinced myself it was too late to ask. Whatever secret they carried, they took it with them to the grave. Or so I believed. It was only last year, while sorting through boxes no one had opened since the 1960s, that I found something that broke the fragile story I had accepted my entire life. A folded paper, yellowed and brittle, with a name crossed out in ink so heavy it tore the page. A second name, a second signature, and a date identical to mine. That was the moment I understood that my life did not begin alone, that whatever happened in that delivery room was not an accident, but a decision, a choice made quietly, permanently, and without my consent. And as I started pulling at that thread, I realized the truth was not buried in the past at all. It was much closer. Close enough to change everything I thought I knew about who I was and why this secret was hidden for so long. If this story is already making you uncomfortable, that is exactly why it matters. Secrets like this survive because no one talks about them, because families convince themselves that silence is safer than truth. If you feel the weight of this revelation, leave a comment and tell me what you think should have happened instead. These confessions only make sense when they are shared, questioned, and understood. If this story is pulling you in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what comes next goes even deeper into the choices that reshape two lives without permission. And now that you know this secret existed, do you want me to develop the next part of the story and reveal how I discovered what really happened after that birth? The hospital where I was born no longer exists, but its choices still breathe through me. In 1947, that building was a place of authority, not compassion. Doctors spoke in lowered voices, nurses followed orders without questions, and young parents trusted white coats more than their own instincts. My mother was only 22. My father had just returned from the war, carrying fears he never learned how to name. When labor became complicated, decisions were made quickly, behind a curtain that did not include them in the conversation. I know this now because the records tell a story my parents never could. Twin pregnancies were considered risks back then, especially when resources were limited and outcomes uncertain. One child could be seen as a blessing, two could be labeled a burden. The file I later found used words like necessary, practical, and discreet, language that strips emotion away and replaces it with procedure. Somewhere in those hours, a doctor suggested a solution that felt reasonable to people who were scared and exhausted. One baby would stay. The other would be placed quietly, immediately, without paperwork that could raise questions later. My parents were told it was temporary, that the other baby would be cared for, that it was for the best. They were also told not to speak of it again. Silence was presented as mercy. And when my mother woke up holding only one child, she was expected to accept the story she was given and move on as if nothing else had happened. No grief counseling, no acknowledgement of loss, just instructions to forget. That silence shaped everything that followed. Every birthday that felt wrong. Every family gathering where something invisible sat between us. My parents did not look relieved. They looked haunted, and now I understand why. They did not give away a child out of cruelty. They complied because they were pressured, because fear was louder than love in that room. But compliance does not erase consequence, it only delays it. If you are still listening, tell me in the comments what you would have done if you were in their place. You can even write the word choice if this part made you stop and think. Do you want me to develop the next topic and explain how the signs of that decision followed me through childhood without my understanding? As a child, I could never explain why my life felt slightly misaligned, as if a piece of it had been removed before I was old enough to notice. I was not unhappy, not abused, not neglected in the obvious ways people imagine. Yet there was a constant undertone of unease, a quiet echo that followed me through hallways, birthdays, and school photographs. It felt like living in a house where one room was permanently locked, even though no one admitted it existed. The signs were subtle but persistent. School forms that asked how many siblings I had were always answered too quickly by my parents, as if rehearsed. Family albums began abruptly, with no hospital photos, no newborn pictures, no explanations. When I asked why there were no images of my birth, my mother would say cameras were expensive then, her voice calm but her hands trembling. My father avoided the conversation entirely. Silence became the family language. There were also official inconsistencies that made no sense to a child but lingered in my memory. A school nurse once questioned my blood type. A doctor commented that my medical file looked unusually thin for someone my age. An old aunt, after a few drinks at a wedding, looked at me too long and said, "You remind me of someone," before being pulled away by my mother with a grip that felt almost desperate. These moments were dismissed, corrected, erased. But they accumulated quietly inside me. At night, the feeling grew stronger. I often dreamed of parallel scenes. The same house, but different choices. The same street, but another boy riding a bike toward me, his face familiar yet unreachable. I woke up with the strange certainty that I was not imagining something new, but remembering something old. Still, memory without proof becomes doubt, and doubt eventually learns to stay quiet. As I grew older, I learned not to ask. Families like ours survived by not reopening wounds, but avoidance does not heal absence. It only teaches it to hide. And that absence followed me into adulthood, shaping my relationships, my fears, my sense that something essential had been withheld. Did not yet know what it was, only that it existed, waiting patiently for the moment when silence would finally fail. The letter was never meant to be found. I know that now. It was tucked inside a medical ledger, pressed between brittle pages that smelled like dust and antiseptic, hidden in a box labeled Taxes 1962. If I had not been forced to downsize my house last year, if age had not made climbing ladders dangerous, that box would still be untouched. But time has a way of rearranging things, especially when it decides you are finally ready to see what you were never supposed to know. The envelope had no return address. Inside was a single page, typed, not handwritten, with margins too precise for something personal. At the top was the name I had lived with for 76 years. Below it, another name, violently scratched out, as if the pen had hesitated and then pressed harder in anger. 2 birth weights, 2 times. Same date, same hospital. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion, but one sentence shattered everything I believed. Second male infant released per special arrangement. I read that line over and over, feeling my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with age. This was not rumor or intuition. This was confirmation. My parents had not lost a child. They had signed something, agreed to something, and someone else had benefited from their silence. The letter mentioned a local placement, no adoption agency listed, no follow-up. Documentation. Just a note indicating proximity, as if distance did not matter because secrecy was assumed. Suddenly, memories rearranged themselves. The neighbors my parents avoided, the street we never walked down, the family friends who disappeared without explanation. I realized the truth was not hidden across states or decades. It had been folded neatly into my everyday life, close enough to touch, yet protected by a shared agreement not to look too closely. What unsettled me most was not that my twin existed, but that the letter never implied distance. No out-of-state transfer, no sealed records across borders, no orphanage lost to time. The wording suggested something far more deliberate. Local placement, immediate resolution. Close enough to monitor, close enough to control. That realization changed the nature of the secret entirely. This was not a separation caused by chaos. It was one maintained by design. I started quietly, carefully. At my age, people underestimate curiosity. They assume you are sorting memories, not creating new ones. I requested old municipal directories, property tax rolls, voter registrations from the 1950s and 1960s. Patterns emerged. One surname kept repeating, always within a narrow radius of my childhood home. A boy born the same day as me, same hospital, same attending physician, listed as an only child in a household that suddenly appeared in records just weeks after my birth. 2 miles. That is the distance that broke me. 2 miles meant we breathed the same air, shopped in the same stores, stood in the same lines without knowing why a face felt familiar. It meant our lives unfolded in parallel, separated not by fate, but by a decision enforced through silence. I wondered how many times our paths crossed without recognition. How many moments passed where the truth hovered just out of reach. The closer I got, the heavier the guilt became. Not guilt for being born, but for living fully while someone else lived a version shaped by a lie he never consented to. I learned about his life slowly. Different school, different church, similar illnesses, similar habits, even similar handwriting, according to a public record signature that made my hands shake when I compared it to my own. This was no coincidence. It was continuity, a story split in two and forced to pretend it was complete. And as I prepared myself to finally confront what that meant, I understood something painful. Finding him would not restore what was lost. It would only expose how much time had already been taken from both of us. I waited 3 weeks before knocking on his door, not because I was afraid of him, but because I was afraid of what recognition might do to both of us. When you reach 76, you think you have already survived your most difficult moments. I was wrong. Standing on that porch, 2 miles from the house where I grew up, I felt like a child again, suspended between truth and denial. When he opened the door, I knew immediately. No document could have prepared me for the shock of seeing my own face altered by a different life. Same eyes, same hesitation in the voice, same instinctive pause before speaking. He did not slam the door. He did not accuse me of anything. He simply stared, as if his body understood before his mind could catch up. We sat at his kitchen table in silence longer than people would find comfortable. Then he said something that confirmed everything. He told me he had always known something was wrong, that his parents avoided the hospital stories, that doctors made strange comments throughout his life, that he had spent decades feeling like an extra version of someone else without knowing why. What followed was not anger, but mourning. We compared timelines and realized how often our lives mirrored each other. Similar careers, similar failures, similar fears around intimacy and trust. We both carried a quiet guilt, shaped by decisions made by adults who believed secrecy was safer than honesty. Neither of us blamed our parents fully, yet neither of us could excuse them. They were young, pressured, and afraid. But fear does not erase harm. It only delays its arrival. The most painful realization was not that we were separated, but that the separation had succeeded for most of our lives. The lie worked. And now, with time nearly gone, the truth arrived without offering repair. There was no way to recover lost birthdays, missed conversations, or the comfort of knowing you were never alone in the world. There was only acknowledgement. There is a cruel illusion we grow up believing, that truth automatically brings relief, that once secrets are exposed, something inside us will finally settle. At my age, I can tell you that is not always how it works. Sometimes the truth arrives not as a solution, but as a reckoning. My brother and I met several more times after that first encounter, carefully, like men handling something fragile and volatile. At the same time, we talked about our parents, about the choices made for us, about the decades spent living incomplete versions of the same story. What haunted us most was not what we lost, but what we were denied the chance to choose. Our lives had been shaped by an invisible hand, guided by fear, convenience, and authority, masquerading as necessity. Doctors, institutions, even neighbors had participated in the silence. This was not just a family secret. It was a system that allowed ordinary people to disappear into paperwork and moral shortcuts. Back then, no one called it cruelty. They called it order. As weeks passed, the weight of that knowledge settled differently on each of us. He felt anger rising where I felt exhaustion. I felt guilt where he felt clarity. And somewhere between those emotions, we both understood that reunion did not mean restoration. You cannot simply stitch together two lives that were separated at birth and expect the seams not to show. The damage was quiet, cumulative, and irreversible. I often think about how many similar stories never reach daylight. How many elderly people carry confessions like this to their graves because revealing them feels pointless once the damage is done. That is why I am speaking now. Not to accuse, not to seek forgiveness, but to leave behind a record that refuses to let silence win completely. Some truths do not heal. They warn. If you stayed until this moment, it means this confession stayed with you. Stories like this only exist because someone chooses not to look away. If you believe these truths matter, subscribe to the channel so these buried stories are not lost again. Leave a like if this revelation changed the way you think about family, silence, and time. And I want you to comment one specific word so I know you reached the end with me. Write, "I heard the truth." Now do not leave yet. The next video appearing on your screen carries another confession that was never meant to be told.